What I want to talk about is essentially something that's very familiar to everybody who's in design. As designers, we all bought into the idea that design is really a way of communicating a message. It's about getting an action and essentially driving some kind of reaction to what you're doing. If you're creating some content, it drives some kind of response of sorts. If you're creating a red button or a green button, we expect a certain reaction, and we are quite comfortable with those patterns because we do them as professionals. So it is slightly weird that a lot of designers find it really hard to talk to people who are non-creatives. I don't know how many of you feel that, but I see it almost on a daily basis with people in the creative business struggling to communicate with, I wouldn't say the normal people, but everybody else. So this topic is about that essentially. So men and women are different. That's inherited in how we were born, in our physiology. It's kind of enhanced by schools, how we are conditioned by our training, our upbringing, what society essentially expects of us. Creatives and everybody else, there's a disconnect there as well. I see them on both sides. We are struggling to understand why people who are not creative don't understand what we're saying. And people who are not creative don't understand anything we're saying and can't quite get their head around how we're talking about things. And then I want to talk about a third group as well, which is senior stakeholders, executives, and they are living on a completely and a totally different plane. The way they think is really, really fast. They are living really in the fast lane. They need to understand everything that's going around in the business. They have so many things that are flying around around their head. So when they talk, often it sounds really superficial, and they jump between different topics, and we're struggling to essentially communicate to them at their level. And these are kind of the three key elements of this conversation. So for talking to senior stakeholders, really you need a simple story that's easily retold. You need a bird's eye view that's actual and accurate, that really covers what you want to see from a broad point of view, but it has to be accurate. It can't be something that can be questioned. It has to be outcome-based, anything that asks for an action, something that you need to happen, something you need help with. And if you can, the best thing about talking to senior stakeholders is talk about progressive disclosure. So make sure that you have all the data to back up what you're saying at these key points that I mentioned here, but be able to answer questions if somebody has questions for you and be prepared to answer those. That essentially is the talk that I have today. And that's pretty much it. Any questions at this point in time? No? Okay, so let's rewind a bit and talk a bit about what I just said. So essentially, a simple story easily retold. There's a pattern of how different groups behave and how we communicate. And there's challenges of how these different groups talk to each other and how they understand each other. Communication to execs requires something that's really simple, that can easily be retold, and it should ideally have some action attached to it. Men and women are different, starting with a broad picture. Creatives and everybody else, zoning in a bit, but we are still bringing people along in the conversation. And execs really live in a different world. But we can see a pattern of how different user groups talk differently to each other and have problems communicating to each other. Actionable, here are 3 tips of how to communicate. And there's a bonus tip of how you essentially can do progressive disclosure when you're talking about things. Now, this is one of the presentations that I see quite often. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this particular pattern, but this is almost always how I see research being presented to a wider audience. It starts with, what is UX? We have this path that are diverging. Research should be done by researchers. We want it to be data valid. We want to be it done by professionals. We can use it for something. There's some methodology and processes for how we want to do it. There are some key principles that we want to follow. There's a plan, normally as complex as possible on one slide. And then there's how we want to, at the end, distill findings. Well, for a senior audience, if you're talking to an exec, they most likely do not know how research works. And frankly, they do not care either, because you're the professionals who have to do it. What they're interested in is, what is the value to the business, and how can I help? What do you guys expect from me as an exec to get this moving? From a design exec point of view, it's kind of the same story. They actually do know how research works, so they don't need a lesson either. What they want to know is, what are we trying to prove that's value to the business? What do I need to do to help you get that moving? So essentially, that kind of presentation is wrong for both audiences. This will be better and significantly fewer slides. Our strategic targets as a business is to reach those targets. We want to prove, we want to do something. This is kind of our next action. However, we're kind of stuck. We need some help from you to get this moved forward. We might need some people there. We might need I don't know, access to some customers, whatever it is, what is the ask that I have? How do you distill it down in a really simple set of slides that can be easily retold? So how do you go about crafting that right message? So women and men, I'm not going to touch on this subject. It is worth looking into, and there's a lot of material online about how people are talking, because it is the foundation of how different groups talk to each other. What I'm going to talk a bit about is how creatives actually operate and how they communicate. How many of you have looked into that particular topic of how designers actually communicate to everybody else? Has anybody ever done any of that research? No? Okay. So how many have seen that one, though? So this one is one that flies around quite a lot. Try to explain how creatives work. It always comes up in presentations where somebody who is not a creative wants to explain how creatives should shoehorn their processes into processes that already exist. Which is kind of wrong, because this one, as all great satire, is really founded on reality, right? And this is actually the process for creative people. That is how the creative process works. It doesn't fit necessarily a straightforward project plan that works for the developers or the QAs. This is really the process of where creativity comes from. That's where you get the idea from. So this really is the project plan for creative work. The creative genius is both more primitive and more cultured, more destructive, more constructive, occasionally crazier, adamant saner than pretty much the average person. This is written by a psychologist who did a lot of studies into what actually drives creativity. How does creative people come up with ideas that other people just wouldn't get around? This is really our USP as designers, is that we have this ability to be conflicting mentally, I guess. There's another one here which I really like, and there's a link to this, and I think the slides are being shared afterwards, so it's worth checking out. But somebody created these 10 bullet points that really describes the creative personality. So I won't go through all of them, but there's kind of 3 I want to highlight here. So for example, the creative person thinks both divergent and convergent at the same time. So as people, as human beings, we know how to discuss something with somebody who's starting to think divergent. We can also understand how to discuss people who are thinking convergent. How do you deal with somebody who does both kind of almost at the same time when you have a conversation? It's bad enough that these poor people that we're talking to are only just catching up with the fact that we're starting to open their minds before we just crashes everything together to a solution and go forward. Another one is that creative people tend to be both extroverted and introverted, again, at the same time. Again, as human beings, we know how to talk to somebody who's extrovert. We might not be conscious around it, but we have an idea about it based on our experience. We also know how to talk to somebody who's more introverted and more closed in. So we have patterns we use when we communicate. So what do we do if you talk to somebody who basically flips like a coin between the two of them? That's really difficult for other people to deal with. I don't know if you can see some of this from your own kind of behavior, but this is what everybody else who's not a creative has to deal with when they communicate with us. And then there's this one about escapes rigid gender stereotyping, which is super interesting. And I've seen that a couple of times where, what's an example? For example, if a man and woman are talking and they are arguing about something, the man will kind of use the physical strength to maybe beef himself up a bit, and that kind of has some kind of impact into the conversation. Doesn't work with creative ladies. It tends to backfire. And the same if you have a woman who maybe tries to be a bit more flirtatious to get some things moving with a guy. That doesn't really work with creative guys either. And I have had female clients coming up to me asking if some of my male designers were actually gay based on some of those experiences. So it's interesting to read those through and see how those map to your own behavior, because that is what people who talk to you have to deal with. The other side of this, of course, this is kind of looking at yourselves. The other side of this is the people you're talking to. So all of you are probably quite well-versed in creating personas and understanding user needs. It's worth doing this with people that you're working with as well. And it becomes more and more important as you are moving up the management ladder and have to deal with a wider audience of stakeholders. So I've done 3 super simple examples here that might not fit your expectations of what a project manager and sales team and technical kind of developer would be, but it gives you an idea of how you can do this quite simply in understanding who you're talking to. Project manager, detail-oriented, timeline-driven, and it's normally spread thin. So if you have to talk to them, for example, using the research example, it's really about having messages that says, Research is not going to mess up your timeline. It's going to be fine. In fact, we can help us get better quality on time without you actually having to do anything except maybe get out of my way. Salespeople, they're target-driven. They like it easy, they really do. And they like to stay with what they know rather than new things. Again, think about the message for them. It's like, here's a package offering with a price tag. You don't have to do anything. Just take this. Here's a couple of slides. Put them in your deck and sell this. You are going to sell stuff anyway. This will give you an additional benefit on top of what you're selling. Technical stuff, feature-focused, like difficult problems, and sometimes have a bit of a communication issue with people in general or communicating what they want to achieve. Again, use that to say, well, research can help put a business case forward for that really technical stuff that you're doing. And you know what? I can help you shape your PowerPoint and craft that message. So in that way, essentially help to achieve your common goals. This is the stakeholder mapping. And I do tend to use stakeholder mapping increasingly as I've progressed through my career. I think I picked it up when I was moved into consultancy at Capgemini back in 2010. But I use this on a daily basis. This is a very simple model that I've used for a long time, which is essentially there's the level of interest and there's the power of the people you're talking to. Level of interest is how much do they actually care about what you're doing? How much does it align with their targets? Power is how much can they influence what is happening? Is it somebody who is super interesting but can't really change things? Or is it somebody who is really powerful within the business but don't really care much about what you're doing? So if you have somebody who's low on interest, low power, there tend to be fewer problems there. Essentially, they tend to be out of the way. Have somebody who's high on interest and low on power. They can be unpredictable but manageable. They might not have a huge amount of impact, but at the same time, they have a lot of interest, so they have a lot of insight into it, and they can kind of either get in the way or be super helpful. Somebody who's got high on power, low on interest, is powerful but predictable. They don't really care. They are just happy with things trickling on, but they're there, and you need to understand them. And then, of course, people with the highest interest and highest power are really the greatest danger and opportunities. And if you map that to how you need to cater for these people in that space, essentially minimal effort, kept informed, keep satisfied, and these are really the key players. I do this, as I said, very regularly with the stakeholders I have to deal with on a day-to-day basis to make sure I understand where all of them are. And I have a sheet where I've filled this out, and I think I have some 50 people, 60 or 70 people by now. There are lots of stakeholder mapping systems out there. You can just Google it, you can find them. There are a lot of tips. I've created my own, which is essentially mapping this one. It says kind of the name of the person, the role they're in, what department or area of responsibility they have. And then there's this interesting one I picked up fairly recently, which is around their mood. So how are they towards what you're doing? And again, that can be based on the targets or what they want to achieve as people. So are they anti what you're doing? Are they actively in your way? Are they kind of none, which is essentially they are kind of negative-ish, but really they're not getting in the way. They're happy with it to trickle along as long as you're not really messing up their style, right? Allow is somebody who's on the other side. They're kind of there. They're there passively. If you needed help, they will probably help. Help is somebody who actively kind of offers the help, and then make are really your partners in crime who will join forces with you and move things forward. And then the influence and interest is essentially what I showed before with power and interest. And then I have two other ones. One is focus, what I should focus on with this particular person. And then notes. Notes tend to be, for me, actually more dates. How often do I want to keep in touch with these people? When did I last meet them? Was there anything to pick up on that one? I have one stakeholder at the moment who is really senior at Sage, really, really busy, completely impossible to get hold of him. He happens to be on Twitter. So I make it a point to essentially keep in touch with him on Twitter. So that way you can do it as well. And I should say I've just joined Sage. When I accepted this kind of speaking gig, I was actually at Salesforce. So between there and now, I've joined a new company. So for me, this has been an amazing tool to essentially get a feel for the landscape of the company I've moved into. So allies and mindsets. I think this has been discussed a couple of times, but really understand what are your priorities. What are the priorities of the people you're talking to, whether they are allies or they are problems or whatever they are? How do I affect their goals? How do they affect my goals? How can I help them reach their goals? But also, what are my asks of them to reach my goals. Now, this is all driven by me. I'm not expecting them to ever come up. It's essentially, I will ask actively, how can I help you get to this and this? And here's my asks of you, can you help me with this and this? Also understand what problems you really have to have help with to solve together. And there are lots of those, and that's really where you need to understand where do your roads kind of merge and how do they move forward. And of course, understand who can solve a direct conflict, and this might not always be as straightforward as it should be. I've just finished season 1 to 7 of Game of Thrones, pretty much back to back, and it does strike me that that's a very good series to look at if you want to look at corporate strategies. There's so many things in there that reminds me of how things are moving back and forward in the office. Allies that are shifting, people that are going side by side with you to a certain point, and people who might be somebody you have conflict with, and then suddenly something else comes in from the side, and suddenly you're on the same side. All these things pretty much you could map like for like. I have this idea of making a comic book series, essentially of each episode, and mapping it to a corporate environment at some point when I retire and if I remember. But it's interesting to think about these patterns because they are essentially human behavior. So they're everywhere around us. It's just a case of making the connections of how they look like in your day-to-day lives. Now, I'm going to end with this one, this is one that you can take or leave. And I'm going to stand behind the laptop because I don't know how powerful the sound is here. Just going to get this ready with my new sort of slider for volume. This is something I've been using, my God, since 2002 maybe. The idea is that every time I walk into a conversation, I have a soundtrack in my head that sets the mood for the conversation I have. So I have some kind of tune or whatever it is. I'm not going to sing it out and loud in front of people or anything like that, but in my head I have some kind of music that I've sort of distilled down as I walked to a particular meeting that would help me set me in the right mood. So think about this, how this would sound like in your head if you're going into a meeting with this, for example. It's not too bad. So you can probably see how that would change your mindset if you're going into a meeting with that in your mind. And there's all sorts of things, right? You could have something like this as well. This is quite a different attitude that you have as you're walking into any kind of conversation. And you can match that to whoever you're speaking to as well to get a feel for how are they? Are they more like an aristocratic type person or whatever? It could also help you if you're going into a meeting where actually you want to keep a mindset of don't really give a fuck how this turns out. So you have that ability as well to basically calm yourself down and have a bit more of a laid-back attitude to that meeting. It can also be really obscure tunes that probably nobody else would ever know if they heard this. Does anybody recognize this? Nope. I'm pretty sure nobody would. But this one is probably one of my favorites, and this is kind of the one I fall back on if I need to go into any kind of meeting and I want to have some decision made. Of course, there are some that are more aggressive of tunes that I would pick up in other conversations and other meetings, but this one for me has kind of always been my fallback. As I said, this is a tip that has worked for me. I want to share it with you in case you want to take it away. It's all about setting the right frame of mind for any conversation. Remember kind of who you are as creatives and how you behave. Remember what the goals are of the people you're talking to. If they're execs, make sure it's a simple message they can retell. And choose some music to really set your mindset and get that conversation going in the right direction. That's really it. I have a slide, and it's going to be on a slide deck with some additional reading material that might be helpful. I think some of this has actually been shown on some of the other slides, but there's 3 articles. One is what happened when I stopped saying sorry at work for a week. Has anybody read that one? It's super good because that actually gives you a lot of confidence when you're in conversation if you stop saying sorry. It works really well. There's, of course, a link to stakeholder analysis, which I think is a hugely powerful tool. It might feel like it's a lot of admin to do, but it's worth it, especially as you're moving up the management ladder. I have a link for roles people play in groups, which is also good for your personal lives. It's an interesting one. A couple of podcasts, Coaching for Leaders. This is a podcast I turn to every time I have any kind of problem in my role as a VP of design. That podcast has a library of everything that you could ever run into as a design leader, or lead designer, or design manager. Looking Sound of Leadership is something similar. It's based on small little sketches. It's only like 10, 15 minutes. It's really, really good as well. I like it because it fits my walk to work. Negotiating for Entrepreneurs is really somebody who is in negotiation tactics from police, I think he was originally, of how to use that in communications in meetings. And then 3 books. 2 of them you probably have heard of, The Prince and How to Win Friends and Influence People. I'm also recommending Life's a Pitch, which is really giving some really hardcore and very clear tips on how to do pitches, going to meetings prepared, how you get the result you want out of those meetings. And with that, I think we're at the end of this conference. Thank you.